Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 24 of my week at the club with my weekly exploits at the Wachusett Chess Club in Fitchburg, Mass. This is Roger Capello, and I hope you all had a happy Christmas, Merry Christmas. It's been a busy few days around our household the last 3 or 4 days, so I haven't gotten to this video yet. It's a little later than I was hoping to get it out, but better late than never. And this week it was a game I played last Wednesday night against Ralph McNeilage on board 2. And you can see that up here in the upper right, where this is our game we're playing, next to Brett Kildall and Ray Paulson, who are on board 1. And a little bit of the head of Paul Godin here, but not very much. And with my usual astronomy, gratuitous astronomy insert here, I decided to throw in one of my favorite sorts of objects. It's a globular cluster called M13. It's in the constellation of Hercules, and it's about the same distance as the center of the galaxy. So 7 or 8 kiloparsecs, or about 24,000 light years, something like that. And globular clusters are like miniature little galaxies, but they're actually satellites to our galaxy. And there are a few hundred of them that we know about. And this particular one has several 100,000 stars in it, and they're spherically symmetric. They just all orbit around one another. It must be pretty spectacular to be on a planet around a star in the center of a globular cluster. But we'll probably never know that. At least I won't. Anyhow, moving along, in the game, Ralph played d4, and as you may recall, Ralph was the guy that beat me 4 or 5 episodes ago, and I was looking for revenge in this match. And I went into, let me get the focus right here, into the lines of a Benko Gambit with c5. Ralph thought for a little while. I guess he didn't really want to accept the Gambit pawn, and he played a very rare continuation with, after d5 and b5, he played a very rare continuation with the move b3. Now, of course, much more normal is to go ahead and accept the Gambit pawn here with CB, or another normal move that's not quite as popular as knight to f3, but there are any number of playable options here. And b3 is perhaps only borderline playable. The results in the database they were played 20 times out of 13,000 games. So that's on the order of 0.1% or so. And black drew 5 and won 15 of those games. So it's pretty heavily biased in black's favor. And not that there's anything instantly wrong with it, but it does yield the initiative to black. I continued it along what I consider the most reasonable option. That is also what most of the people in the database chose as well, which is to go ahead with the idea of fianchettoing. And with the Benko Gambit or Benoni, you want to get this bishop on this long diagonal where it exerts an influence maybe all the way as far as a1. And of course, in this case, he's, in a sense, has fianchettoed on the queen side, so he's able to counter that with bishop to b2. And that will, often it will nullify the effect of the bishop along that diagonal, possibly exchanging for the bishop. Some other times, though, I've seen positions where this bishop on b2 is actually a drawback for the white position, because as you can see, it's not defended, and there can be various tactics based on the knight moving and threatening something else, and at the same time uncovering the attack on this bishop. So it's a double-edged move. After I fianchettoed my bishop, Ralph continued with knight to d2. Given that he wants to keep the line of his bishop open here, that would seem to be a reasonable move. And it does have, some upsides to it. The downside is that the knight in these Benko Gambit structures often wants to be on c3 so that it can, at some point, possibly hop to b5. So I've seen games where this a pawn, in fact, I've had it happen to me, where the a pawn gets pushed to a4 and then supports a strong knight on b5. With it going through d2, it can't reach that square easily. On the other hand, it is immediately poised to hop into c4, which is in Benoni type positions where the knight often goes, although it's usually this knight, the king's knight, that comes out to f3, back to d2, and then to c4. So it's an interesting idea. I castled. He developed his other knight. I played d6, which isn't essential at this point, but it does. It fits in with my development. I've got, this is typical with these sort of Benoni-like structures. There's a problem with the minor pieces, the two knights and the light squared bishop, kind of tripping over themselves because there's not a lot of room behind the pawns. And that's why in Benonis you often want to trade off at least one pair of minor pieces to make the mobility of the black pieces a bit better, working behind the ranks. And that square d7 sooner or later is going to be needed for one of those three pieces. And it could be this knight on f6 that comes back to that square. It could be the bishop that develops out through that diagonal. It could be the knight that uses that square. And at the same time, it's defending this pawn on c5, although the pawn on c5 is not being attacked at this time. But, of course, it could easily come under attack at some point. Okay, after I played d6, Ralph played e4, which is kind of a standard move in these sorts of structures. It supports his pawn center, although that e-pawn can sometimes, particularly in Benonis, come under attack. And I made a move here which is pretty rare, as you can see from my notes I made to myself here, that at this point, out of that initial 13,000 games in Benko Gambit territory after Black played b5, we're down to 20 games again. This is actually sort of interesting because this whole line, by transpositions, we go in and out of positions that are more popular and then less popular. And at this point, we're back to 20 games in the database, but still not very many out of the potential Benko Gambit positions. And BC was only chosen once in all those games. The majority of them, the player with black played b5, so this move. I think where the idea is, again, couple-fold. One is not to allow white to develop his pieces, which can happen after you exchange the b-pawn for the c-pawn. Second is to defend this b-pawn. There has to be some, right now it's attacked twice, bishop and the pawn. And one possibility, I suppose, would be to just play a6 and leave this pawn around after pawn takes pawn, not to recapture, but to make some other move like knight to d7. And it'll be a typical Benko Gambit position again. And that was actually something I considered doing. But instead, I captured, and the reason for that was sort of specific. At this point, he has three different ways to recapture this pawn. And I saw a downside for each one of those three ways. Now, if he captured with the pawn, then at some point, either immediately or sometime later, I might be able to play queen to b3 and put pressure on this undefended piece over here. Or come out further and just play on the dark squares come out with my queen all the way to a5 is another possibility. If he took with the knight, that's sort of the easiest one to throw out, because if he takes with the knight, then this pawn on e4 will be lost because that knight is defending it. So really what he wanted to do, what he chose to do, was to play bishop takes. And the upside of it for him, of course, is that he gets to capture that pawn in a single bishop move, I would have preferred waiting till after the bishop developed to like e2 or d3 and then capture the pawn so that he would waste a tempo recapturing. But the upside of it for me is that it now then allows me to play a5 with the idea of continuing on very shortly with my bishop to a6 and forcing the exchange of that bishop. So that indeed happens. He plays queen to c2, and then I play bishop to a6. And this will force the exchange of the bishop, not necessarily immediately, but he can't move off of that diagonal. And at some point, even if he doesn't exchange it, I'll be able to exchange that bishop. And the reason for exchanging it is the light squared bishop is often, oddly enough, a piece that white wants to exchange in either a Benoni, where it usually would come out to c5 to g4 and then get exchanged for the knight on f3, or as I did it here, played a bit a6 and get exchange for white's light squared bishop along that diagonal. And again, it's just a question of easing the congestion for black's pieces, and the knights are a little more valuable given the pawn structure than that light squared bishop is. Okay, he castled, which seems like a reasonable move. I developed my knight. He moved his rook to support the e-pawn and also to hint at an upcoming thrust with that pawn to e5. It's not deadly, but it's something that black has to take into account. And I played knight b6. Now, it turns out that this is the first time we get into really new territory. Up till now, we've been in one or more games in the database. And at this point, if instead of playing knight to b6, if I had pushed my a-pawn, we would have followed Alexei Driev versus Dubov, I forget his first name, who played a sequence of moves that looked like this. That light squared bishop got traded off, and the knights are going to get traded off soon, and they played to a fairly peaceful draw in that position. Okay, instead with my knight to b6, that gives us a new position, is threatening to exchange my knight for his bishop, and basically is forcing the, or at least I felt it was forcing the trade of the bishop. He actually didn't play it quite that way. He played queen to d3 first, and this then makes me capture his bishop. Either I capture the bishop, or I'd have to retreat with my bishop, which clearly wouldn't be very much in my interest. And the question is, after I take his bishop, how is he going to recapture? And he did it with his knight. The queen, of course, couldn't, because my knight is attacking that square. He could have taken with the pawn, but I think this position, looks quite reasonable for black. My queen will probably get developed to c7, and my other rook will come to the open file, and this knight might become further active here on the queen side. So, black is getting his typical sort of queen side play in this position if he did that. Instead, he played knight takes c4, and that allowed me to push my pawn to a4, and then I was starting to feel pretty good about this position. I'm threatening to push it even further to, well, no, I'm not. It would get captured. At some point, if I want, I can trade off the knight, and then after I do so, I could push the pawn to a3. Also, in some variations, I could play a takes b3, and he would have this weak, isolated pawn on b3 that I could play against, and I would have a better pawn structure. So this is looking pretty good. If he captures my pawn, that just invites my knight into his position. So instead, he traded off knights, and I took back with my queen, and made that thrust in the center with his e-pawn. And there are a few possibilities here. What I chose was to go ahead and to capture his pawn. I also, as I recall, considered briefly playing my knight out to g4, attacking that pawn, which is also a good move. See, this is one of those positions in which I was talking about before, in which that bishop on b2 can become a liability, because right now that pawn is pinned. And unfortunately, I can't win it because he has it adequately defended. He has a bishop, knight, and rook all on it. I have it attacked 3 times as well, pawn, bishop, and knight. I could attack it a 4th time, but he could defend it again. So I believe, let me turn the engine on here and cheat a little bit. Queen c4, oh, okay. It shows me not winning the pawn, but in sense exchanging it for the e pawn. That is, I end up winning the sorry, I win the e pawn, and I exchange it for the a pawn over here, with a decent 3/4 pawn advantage to black. What I did though is still a fairly good advantage to black. When I take that pawn, for example, if I turn on the analysis engine right here, it's not as good though. Okay, so knight g4 was actually a stronger move in this case. And I did consider it, but I didn't consider it enough, obviously. I can't really, at this point, I can't remember what it was that put me off of that move. But there was something that that I didn't like so well. Maybe it was just inviting, opening up the e-file and inviting some pressure along the e-file against my e7 pawn. I was a little worried about that. But it looks like black could have gone down that line pretty successfully. So back to the game here. Instead, I captured the pawn, and he captured with his bishop. In those positions before, I forgot. Sorry to mention this. His b pawn is actually a fixed target here. At least it's fixed on the b file, because if he were to try to trade the pawn off for my a pawn, his bishop hangs, because it's undefended and it's being attacked by my queen through the shield of his pawn. So that pawn can't move. So after pawn up, pawn takes, he took back with a bishop in order to unpin that pawn, or at least I assume that's so. It also has a very nice, the bishop on this e5 square has a very nice feature from his point of view, that it's controlling this b8 square. And that's often an important square in these Benko Gambit kind of positions. The a file and d file, black wants to play along with their heavy pieces, and you really don't want to, black wants to be able to use that square. You don't want to cede control of it to white. Now, what this did do was allow me, though, to put his isolated d pawn under pressure. It's a second attack with my knight and rook, and he can't really defend it on that square because if he played rook over to d1 or something, I could just go ahead and take, because my rook is less valuable than the queen. And the sequence of captures here, well, I'll just show it. It's simple. If the rook gets onto that file, even though there are 2 defenders, it's not good, because these are less valuable pieces that I'm attacking with, and I end up winning material. I've won his, let's see, queen, rook, both have a rook and a bishop. I have a queen for a rook and a knight, which of course is a material edge for black. So he can't do that, so he's fairly much forced to do what he did, which was to exchange off the knight. And I was happy to see that, because that just makes my bishop come to life on the long diagonal. Now it's totally open. It eyes all the way to a1. and it also defends this pawn on e7 very nicely. So it's got quite a reach here on those two diagonals, and it's also restricting White's knight. I came down, ended up coming down a dubious line. My next move was fine though. I mean, I captured the b pawn, and he took back with the queen. That's okay. If I trade queens now, he would have an isolated b pawn. I'd have an isolated c pawn, and he has an isolated d pawn. So a lot of weak pawns, and that's the line that I went in for. One of the advantages to this is I have control now over the a file because of this square that my bishop is dominating. But then I got a little carried away. I decided to try to win this d pawn right away, and that was the wrong idea. But when I analyzed, I thought I didn't see how he could keep from losing the d pawn. And so when you see something like that, it's hard to resist. But I had the right idea going after a weak pawn. It turns out that the d pawn wasn't really the best pawn to go after, and there was quite a pretty line. Rather than playing rook d7, which is what I did in order to put more pressure along the d line, instead of doing that, there was a neat move that the engine suggested, which was to play the rook to a3, attacking this b pawn. Now, his rook can't come over, his rook on the back rank can't come over to defend it, because then his d pawn hangs. That rook is tied down. So then he has to defend it with the rook that's on the e file. So he goes to e3. But then that allows me to push the e pawn, because now this pawn is totally pinned along this file. He can't capture and allow me to win his rook. You can push it, however, but then I end up winning this pawn. It's too far advanced. And the line that was given was to go ahead and block the file with my bishop. The only way to, in this position, to keep from losing the d pawn immediately is to go ahead and capture the bishop. And I recapture, and he comes over to attack it a second time. He can't take it immediately because there's a back rank mate. If the rook takes the pawn, then this is just simply checkmate. So instead he doubles up so he can take it with the other pawn, and I have time to support it with my e pawn. And Stockfish gives almost a pawn and a half advantage to black in this position, which would have been enough, I think, to win with some sort of accurate play. But instead, I played this idea. I went after the d pawn, thinking I could make use of many of the same pins, but this is not as robust. Excuse me. And the reason is that the knight can come in immediately and attack my rook. I didn't think he could do this, but it turns out he can, because the reason I thought he couldn't do it is that I could trade the knight off, and he takes back with the rook. Hold on a second, I'm going to get a glass of water. Thank you. I should remember to have water nearby when I'm recording. It dries out your throat, all that talking. So as you recall, I'm trying to recall here, after he took back with the rook, my idea was to push the e pawn, and his d pawn is now pinned. But the problem is that even though the d pawn is pinned, and it looks like I'm going to be able to capture it, so what I looked at was horrible moves like ed, in which case rook takes rook is immediate mate, or slightly less horrible moves like pushing the pawn, but then I simply win it, and he can't take it with his rook because now my a rook down is made on the back rank. and he doesn't have time to play rook takes pawn because I'm attacking his rook, which would get him mated. So I thought I was winning a pawn in this sequence, but what I overlooked was his simple reply, which was to make Luft, play g3, and now his king can escape. I have that pawn attack twice, but so what? He has it defended twice. Unfortunately, I can't, I can almost chase the rook off the rank with f6 because I would then be attacking all four of these squares, which is a nice thing, but unfortunately he can just simply win the e-pawn that way. So that doesn't work. So after he makes Luft, I couldn't see any way anymore to win this position. By the way, I see I have another variation here I jumped over. When I played e6, it was a miscalculation because I didn't see that g3 move. But it turns out that rook to a3 is still good. So just to show that line quickly, because again, it's similar to the other one, but it's pretty. I attack it. In this case, he can defend it by rook to b1. Notice if he played his rook up to d3, then this pawn is now pinned. That's on b3, and I can simply push my c-pawn and attack his rook and the pawn at the same time. So I'm going to play pawn takes pawn, and well, actually, it's worse than that, isn't it? That what I said was just true, but if he comes off the c-pawn, he gets checkmated. If he comes off the if he comes off the, let's get the right position here, rook a3. If he comes off the back rank, I don't even have to try to win the pawn. Just this is going to be checkmate in a couple more moves. So he can't come off the back rank. And instead, he comes over to the b file to defend this pawn. But then I can attack it a second time. And it's a threat because it looks like, well, gee, he has this counter threat on my e-pawn. If I were, if he wastes time somehow, I'm not quite sure how to waste time without. Let's say if I played, if White played his rook back to the first rank, it looks like Black would be prevented from winning the pawn because of the sequence, rook takes, rook takes, rook takes, and now he wins the e-pawn, but unfortunately he gets checkmated on the back rank again. So hope this is not too confusing here. So after I come over and put a second attack on that b-pawn, he plays a king to f1 to get out of those back rank mate situations. And Black can go ahead and make use now of the pin along the b file to put a third attack on it. And White can go ahead and push that pawn, but Black shields it from support by attacking it from the same side that White has his rook on, which is kind of a pretty little move. White can't afford to take that rook because then the passed b pawn is too strong. So this sort of sequence is deadly. I don't know. A rook over attacking it doesn't work because I defend it right away. Rook back, and I take the pawn, and it's defended and supported from behind. It's very bad. So anyhow, in this sequence now, after I play rook to b3, White would have to play rook to b1, and then I can simply take his b pawn, and I've got a protected passed pawn that I'm up. So that would all be very nice. Unfortunately, I didn't see that. Instead, I played this e6 move, and after he made Luft, I sat here and calculated for quite a while and saw absolutely no way to make progress. It turns out if I turn the engine on here, it agrees with me. There's a very, few tenths of a pawn edge for Black, but there's no line that if you go along with it, it doesn't have any way to really make progress. And so basically I played more or less of a forcing line to a draw here. I went ahead and took his e-pawn, he recaptured. I traded off a pair of rooks, checked, got behind his pawn. He didn't want to take a passive post here on d3 defending it. So he took my pawn, I took his pawn. And now with a pair of rooks and 3 pawns symmetric on the same side of the board there, that's just totally dead drawn. Nothing to be done. And so we agreed to a draw in this position. I offered it and he accepted. So it wasn't the outcome I was looking for in this game, but I think it was, Ralph played a good game. I mean, there were only a few places where Black was able to get a slight advantage here by getting that mobile A-pawn and working on a few pin ideas. And I had a very slight edge, which, if my technique were good enough, I would have been able to nurse it into a winning rook and pawn endgame here. But I just, at this point, I just overlooked this winning idea of rook to a3, which would have been pretty. I wish I'd seen it, but I guess I'd better keep working on those rook and pawn endgames, like a lot of us probably feel that we need to do. So thanks for tuning in. I will undoubtedly move down a board or two for the last round of the tournament because I only have 3 out of the possible 4 points right now. So I'm not really in contention to win it anymore, but I'll bring that game to you anyhow and let you see how it turns out. So so long for now. Bye-bye.